A gloomy morning in Kansas City. A black man in a sharp suit stood quietly on the sidewalk, waiting for someone outside an old, weathered cafe. He had no idea that within minutes his life would be thrust into the heart of a public storm. In the distance, a police car screeched to a halt. A white deputy stepped out, eyes filled with suspicion, hand resting on his handcuffs. "This isn't a place for someone like you," he said, his voice as cold as steel. No name asked, no ID checked. He saw only skin color, and acted. But what the deputy didn't know was that the man he just humiliated and arrested was a federal judge, and the shockwaves from that reckless mistake wouldn't just destroy his career. They would shake the very foundations of the justice system he thought he controlled. This wasn't just a wrongful arrest. This was a collision between prejudice and justice. The question is, are you ready to witness the truth? Before we dive into today's powerful story, we want to share a message from the heart of brave stories. This channel stands for something greater than just storytelling. We stand for justice, equality, and the fight against racism. Here, every narrative is a tribute to courage, resistance, and the strength it takes to overcome. This is a safe space, a space where voices that have been silenced are finally heard, where dignity is non-negotiable, and where discrimination has no place. If you believe in truth, in justice, and in the power of real stories to spark change, you're in the right place. So get ready. A gripping tale full of twists, revelations, and powerful lessons awaits. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a chapter in this journey. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments. It was a gray-skied morning in Kansas City, the kind where the clouds hung low and the wind carried the weight of unspoken things. On 43rd and Prospect, the streets whispered with the ghosts of stories that never made the evening news, stories of sirens echoing too long and justice showing up too late. Brick buildings lined the sidewalks, most tagged with graffiti and boarded-up windows, a visual history of abandonment in a neighborhood forgotten by all but those who called it home. Among them walked Jamal Sinclair, alone, dressed in a charcoal gray overcoat and polished black shoes that clicked softly against the cracked pavement. Tall, composed, and quietly observant, Jamal moved like a man who carried more than himself. He moved like a man on a mission. Beneath the surface of his calm there was urgency. He checked his watch, 10:13 a.m. He was early for his meeting, but that was deliberate. He wanted to get a feel for the place. The man he was meeting, a former precinct clerk turned whistleblower, had insisted they speak in person, in a neutral location, away from prying eyes. The cafe they had agreed on, Margie's Spot, was a small corner diner nestled between a payday loan shop and an abandoned church, its windows fogged by decades of grease and stories. Jamal leaned against the brick wall next to the entrance, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sweeping the street. From across the intersection, Deputy Leonard Foster sat in his squad car, engine running, arms draped over the steering wheel, chewing gum like it was the only thing giving him purpose. He'd been patrolling this district for over a decade, and his instincts, honed by arrogance more than training, told him when someone didn't belong. And this guy, this tall black man in a tailored coat and polished shoes, standing outside a dive diner in the middle of what Foster called the bad blocks? No way he was local. No sagging jeans, no hoodie, no signs of desperation. That meant trouble. To Foster, it was like watching a wolf walk into a sheep farm with a clipboard and a grin. The deputy narrowed his eyes, tilted his cap back, and scoffed. "What's this guy playing at?" he muttered. He didn't recognize Jamal, and that was enough to make him a suspect. In Foster's world, the uniform was law, and intuition was justification. Without hesitation, he swung the car door open and stepped out, the clang of it closing behind him echoing like a gavel. Jamal spotted him from the corner of his eye, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the kind of self-importance that made people either shrink or square up. Foster adjusted his belt, his hand brushing the cuffs on his utility belt as if reminding both himself and the world who had the power. He walked, with that slow, deliberate stride common to men intoxicated by control. Jamal stayed still, calm. He'd seen this type before. He didn't need to panic. He needed to stay measured. "Morning," Foster said flatly as he approached. Not friendly, not curious. Just another authority figure trying to make the air feel heavier. Jamal gave a polite nod. "Morning, officer." Foster's eyes narrowed. "May I ask what you're doing here?" he said, voice sharp, clipped. No greeting, no introduction. Just suspicion dressed in a badge. "I'm waiting for someone," Jamal replied calmly. "Meeting a friend for breakfast." Foster chuckled, but it was a dry, humorless sound. "A friend? Here?" He looked Jamal up and down like he was a riddle wrapped in disrespect. "You know this isn't exactly the business district, right?" "I'm aware of where I am," Jamal said, voice steady. "And I don't believe it's a crime to wait for someone in public." That did it. Foster's jaw clenched. Something about Jamal's calmness rubbed him the wrong way, too poised, too confident. Foster was used to fear, to panic. He thrived on it. But this man wasn't giving him that. He was composed. That was dangerous. "You got ID on you?" Foster demanded. Jamal's brow lifted slightly. "Am I being detained?" It was the kind of question that always ticked Foster off. To him, asking about rights was the same as questioning his authority, and nobody questioned Deputy Leonard Foster. "You're about 2 seconds from being more than detained," Foster snapped. "You're loitering in a high crime area in a suspicious manner. That suit doesn't change that." Before Jamal could respond, Foster stepped forward, grabbed his arm, and twisted it behind his back. The suddenness of it startled a nearby older woman walking her dog. She froze, phone trembling in her hand, unsure if she should intervene or not. Jamal grunted as he was shoved face first against the wall, the brick biting into his cheek. "You're under arrest," Foster growled, pulling the cuffs out like a cowboy pulling his pistol. "For what?" Jamal asked through clenched teeth, not resisting, but not hiding his disgust. "For acting like you own the place," Foster muttered, snapping the cuffs on with unnecessary force. "And for refusing to cooperate. Let's go, boss man." The word boss dripped with venom. A couple of pedestrians had stopped. One young man started filming with his phone. "Yo, he wasn't doing anything, man," he called out. "Mind your damn business," Foster barked, dragging Jamal toward the patrol car. Jamal, even in cuffs, held his head high. Inside, his mind was already working, not just to stay composed, but calculating, remembering badge numbers, recording every detail. The backseat door slammed shut behind him, sealing him in with the metallic clunk of assumed guilt. Foster got into the front seat, smirking, his fingers tapping the steering wheel. "You guys think wearing a nice suit gives you a pass," he muttered as he drove. "Bet you're one of those fake motivational speaker types, hustling people with big words and no real job." Jamal didn't answer. Instead, he looked out the window as the streets passed by. Places he knew from his childhood, from cases he'd read, from lives he tried to save from the very system now misjudging him. As the car rolled deeper into the precinct's perimeter, the squad radio buzzed. Foster barely noticed until it repeated, then again this time louder. "Unit 43, respond. Immediate request to identify a suspect matching your 1084. Possible high-profile individual. Confirm status." Foster reached for the mic with a frown. "Yeah, I got him. Black male, early 40s, suit, no ID. Picked him up on 43rd and Prospect. Brought him in." There was a pause. Then, "Deputy Foster, you need to return to the station immediately and stand down." "Do you have any idea who that is?" Foster stared at the mic, his pulse skipping. "Come again?" The voice on the radio was different now. Sharper, more urgent. "That man is Judge Jamal Sinclair. Repeat. Federal appellate judge, let him go immediately. Do not proceed further." Foster's stomach dropped. His grip on the mic loosened. The name hit him like a freight train. Judge? Federal? In the back seat, Jamal met Foster's gaze in the rearview mirror. He hadn't said a word, but his eyes said it all. You made a mistake, and it's too late to take it back. Panic began to seep in, crawling up Foster's spine like cold water. He reached for the volume dial and turned the radio down. He needed time to think. Time to figure out how to spin this, but every second that passed only made it worse. He glanced at Jamal, now sitting stone still, an aura of quiet retribution building around him. The kind of silence that doesn't yell but echoes forever. "You didn't tell me who you were," Foster said finally, his voice almost accusing. "You never asked," Jamal answered quietly. The words hung in the air like a blade suspended over the deputy's career. The silence stretched, thick with realization. Foster's hands trembled ever so slightly as he pulled into the precinct parking lot. His swagger was gone. In its place, doubt, shame, and the creeping fear of consequence. As he parked, another car pulled in, fast, sleek. Out stepped a man in a navy blue suit, Brandon Hale. His expression was thunder. As he stormed toward the cruiser, a reporter followed at a distance, camera already rolling. Foster froze, and in the mirror, Jamal smiled. Just slightly. The game had changed, and Foster didn't even know the rules anymore. The fluorescent lights inside the precinct flickered slightly, casting a pale, sterile glow over the chipped floors and beige walls, as Deputy Leonard Foster pushed open the side door with a quiet slam. His grip on Jamal Sinclair's arm had loosened, but the bruising metal cuffs still clung tight to Jamal's wrists like an insult that refused to fade. Officers behind the reception desk gave passing glances, some curious, others indifferent, just another arrest in a day filled with them. But there was something different about this one. The man in the expensive overcoat didn't look like he belonged in the backseat of a cruiser or the steel-legged chair in Interrogation Room 3. He was too composed, too quiet. His silence wasn't surrender, it was waiting, and Foster could feel it in the pit of his stomach. He shoved Jamal down into the chair, the cuffs still locked. Oh, Jamal didn't resist. He just looked up, eyes calm, expression unreadable, like a man who already knew how the story ended. Foster paced in a tight circle. His swagger had returned in flickers, but something gnawed at him now. The radio call from earlier, the one with the urgent voice calling him by name, still rang in his ears. Judge Jamal Sinclair. Number couldn't be. He would have known. Right? Foster gritted his teeth and walked over to the desk, flipping open a blank interrogation form as if the routine might stabilize him. Let's start with a name, he muttered without looking up. Jamal said nothing. Foster glanced up. I asked you a question. Jamal stared at him, unblinking. Are we doing this formally now? He asked, voice low but firm. Because if so, I'd like my attorney present. Foster scoffed, though it didn't come out as confident as he hoped. You don't get to make demands, not here, not now. But apparently you do, Jamal replied smoothly. Without cause, without due process, without knowing who the hell you're even arresting. That stung more than it should have. Foster slammed the folder shut and turned, pressing both hands on the table to lean in. Listen, I don't care who you think you are. You don't talk back to me in my precinct. Jamal tilted his head. Is that what this is? Your precinct. Foster opened his mouth, but the phone in his pocket rang sharply. Loud, insistent, shrill. He glanced at the number, unfamiliar, but internal. He stepped into the hallway and answered. Foster? A pause, then a clipped, almost surgical voice spoke. Deputy Foster, this is Lieutenant Graham from the Chief's office. Is the suspect in custody? Foster hesitated. Yes, sir. Detained. Currently in... Release him immediately. Sir, That is Judge Jamal Sinclair. He is a sitting federal appellate judge and a member of the statewide Commission for Police Accountability. The chief has already been contacted. The mayor's office is involved. You made a mistake. A long silence stretched through the line. Foster blinked. Words caught in his throat. Let him go. Now. Click. Foster lowered the phone slowly, hand trembling. He turned back toward the door to Interrogation Room 3. His pulse thudded louder with each step. Judge. The word echoed, louder than the sirens he once found comfort in. Inside the room, Jamal was still seated, still waiting, his hands folded neatly on the table as if he were the one holding court. Foster opened the door and stood there, stunned. I take it you got your call, Jamal said without looking up. I didn't know, Foster muttered. You didn't ask, Jamal repeated just as he had earlier, this time letting the silence that followed carry the weight. The tension between them thickened, pulsing with unfinished anger and 1,000 unspoken truths. Foster finally stepped forward and pulled the key from his pocket. He knelt and removed the cuffs, but even that felt like a performance, like trying to unring a bell. The metal clinked as it hit the table. Jamal massaged his wrists, wincing slightly. At that moment, the door behind them flew open. A gust of energy entered with Brandon Hale, Jamal's friend and civil rights attorney. flanked by 2 uniformed officers who barely had time to announce his presence. "Step away from him," Brandon barked, his voice slicing through the room like a whip. "Mr. Hale," one of the officers began. "I'm his legal counsel. I suggest you treat this as such." Brandon stormed in and stood between Jamal and Foster, his expression a mask of fury and control. "You put your hands on a federal judge, Leonard," he said, pronouncing Foster's name with venom. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Foster backed away instinctively. It was a misunderstanding. Brandon turned, eyes blazing. Oh, it was definitely a misunderstanding, the kind that cost careers, the kind that gets broadcast live, the kind that turns into class action lawsuits. "Brandon," Jamal said quietly, putting a hand on his friend's arm. "Let him speak." Brandon stared at Foster, nostrils flaring. "Fine, speak." But Foster couldn't. Not really. Not when his thoughts were sprinting from excuse to excuse, looking for shelter from a storm that had already arrived. "I didn't recognize him. He didn't ID himself. You thought black man in a suit equals criminal," Brandon finished. "You thought authority means never having to be curious. You thought the badge was enough." Foster looked at Jamal, searching for something. Understanding, forgiveness, even pity. But Jamal's face was impassive. "What happens now?" Foster asked, voice quieter, like a child who just realized the fire he lit was burning down the house. Jamal stood up, taller, stronger. The room suddenly felt smaller, with him standing. "Now," he said, "now you learn what it feels like to answer to something bigger than your ego." The door opened again. This time it was the chief of police, face flushed, tie loosened. He looked between the 3 men and closed the door behind him. "Judge Sinclair," he said with forced politeness, "on behalf of the department—" "Don't," Jamal interrupted. The chief blinked. "Excuse me?" "Don't give me the scripted apology," Jamal said. "We're past that. Your deputy assaulted a federal judge without cause. He racial profiled me, humiliated me, and dragged me in here without even verifying who I was. If the system is this reckless with someone like me, imagine what happens to those without titles." "Judge Sinclair, we are investigating." "No, you're containing." Jamal's voice rose just slightly. "And I suggest you start preparing for what comes next, because I promise you I won't be the last person to speak." The chief stepped back, visibly shaken. "We'll issue a formal statement." Jamal turned to Brandon. "I'm ready to go." Brandon gave a tight nod and opened the door. As they walked out, officers throughout the precinct stopped what they were doing. The room fell quiet. Foster stood behind, face pale, watching the man he thought he could control walk out free and stronger. Outside, the air was sharper, colder. Cameramen had begun to gather, tipped off by early whispers. Brandon turned to Jamal. "You sure you want to face them?" Jamal looked at the cameras, then at the sky. "Let them see me. Let them see what happened. I've spent my life inside courtrooms fighting for justice. Now it's time they see what justice looks like when it's personal." They stepped forward into the spotlight. Back inside, Foster slumped into the interrogation chair. He had forced Jamal into only an hour ago. The irony wasn't lost on him. He stared at the discarded cuffs on the table, the same ones he used to feel powerful. Now they just looked like artifacts of a man who no longer recognized himself. The chief turned to him with quiet rage. "You're done, Foster, you hear me? You're suspended effective immediately. I've got a mayor, a governor, and half the city's legal brass breathing down my neck. You think your instincts are going to save you now?" Foster didn't answer. He was still staring at the cuffs. The storm didn't hit all at once. It rolled in like smoke under a door, silent at first, barely visible, until it swallowed everything. The moment Jamal Sinclair stepped out of the precinct beside Brandon Hale, flanked by flashing cameras and shocked reporters, the air itself shifted. A black man in a crisp overcoat, head held high, wrists still red from the cuffs that bound him only moments ago. His image was electric, viral. And like wildfire on dry grass, the story spread. Within an hour, hashtags began trending. Within a day, national news anchors were calling it the Kansas City incident. By the second day, every major outlet had published the headline, "Federal Judge Wrongfully Arrested by Local Deputy in Racial Profiling Controversy." The fallout inside the police department was immediate. Deputy Leonard Foster was placed on administrative leave before he'd even had time to clock out. What had begun as a swaggering morning patrol ended in a spiral of internal investigations, emergency meetings, and public apologies read through gritted teeth. Foster sat alone in his home that evening, TV on mute, watching his own mugshot flash across the screen as a person of interest in a civil rights abuse case. He barely recognized himself in the photo. Eyes sunken, mouth slightly open, expression blank. His wife hadn't called. His union rep hadn't returned his messages. In just 12 hours, everything he built on fear and bluster was crumbling. But the real weight, the one pressing down on his chest like a loaded vest, wasn't the public shaming. It was the quiet realization that he had become exactly what people accused the system of being: violent, careless, racist. Meanwhile, Jamal was quiet, calculating. He gave no public statement that first day. He didn't rage in front of the cameras. He didn't weep on cue. He let the silence speak for him. In the shadows of flashing bulbs and clicking shutters, he held his composure like armor, even as the weight of humiliation pulsed just beneath his skin. But behind the scenes, he moved swiftly. With Brandon Hale at his side, he filed a formal federal civil rights complaint against Deputy Foster and the Kansas City Police Department. The lawsuit cited wrongful arrest, racial profiling, excessive force, and obstruction of civil liberty. It wasn't just about what happened to Jamal. It was about the system that allowed Foster to act the way he did and expect to get away with it. The department scrambled. The police chief, long considered a political survivor, found himself at the center of a brewing catastrophe. He held a press conference the next day, the city's skyline shadowing his words. "This does not reflect the values of our department." It was the usual script, written by PR, spoken without conviction. But the cameras caught the way his hands trembled when a reporter shouted, "If it doesn't reflect your values, then why is this not the first time we've heard complaints about Foster?" Behind closed doors, the chief began purging. Files were reopened. Foster's previous arrests, some of which involved vague charges, mysteriously lost body cam footage, and suspicious use of force, were dragged out from the filing cabinets and into the light. One by one, they were reviewed. Names long buried were spoken again. Faces resurfaced, and slowly it became clear. Jamal Sinclair wasn't the first. He was just the first with power. The tension in the city simmered. Protesters began gathering in front of the courthouse. Not violent, not disorganized, just present, holding signs, chanting names, including Jamal's. But more importantly, they chanted the names of those who hadn't made it to a courtroom. The invisible victims, the overlooked, the ones who couldn't afford lawyers or had no social capital to shield them. Jamal watched them from the window of his apartment, high above the city. His face was expressionless, but his eyes burned. "We're doing this for them now," he told Brandon. And then came the hearing. The city was buzzing. Foster, still suspended, was summoned to court, not as an officer, but as a defendant. For the first time he entered the courtroom not with a badge, but with trembling fingers and hollow eyes. He avoided looking at Jamal, seated at the plaintiff's table in his judicial robes. Irony bled from every corner of the room. The man he had tried to reduce to a statistic now stared back at him from a position of irrefutable authority. The courtroom was electric. Journalists packed the benches. Citizens watched from overflow rooms. Brandon Hale's opening statement cut like a scalpel. This isn't about one arrest. This is about a culture that tells certain officers they are above accountability and tells certain citizens they are below dignity. My client is a federal judge, but had he been a young black man without a title, we wouldn't be here. He'd still be behind bars, or worse. The defense stammered. They cited confusion, poor judgment, even attempted to suggest that Jamal's presence in a known hotspot could reasonably raise concern, but the damage was done. The audio recording from Jamal's phone, which captured Foster's dismissive remarks and disdainful tone, was played aloud in the courtroom. The judge, this time the one presiding, winced as the words echoed off the walls. "What are you doing here, huh? Don't look like you belong." The silence that followed was more damning than any argument. After the hearing, as Foster left the courthouse surrounded by reporters, his hands shook with shame. A camera caught him trying to speak, but no words came. He looked like a man unraveling. Inside his own home, hate mail had begun to arrive. Neighbors no longer waved. Old friends stopped calling. And when he walked into a coffee shop, a young black boy stared at him, then turned to his mother and whispered, "Is that the cop who arrested the judge?" But for Jamal, consequences weren't enough. Justice for him meant change. He wasn't content to stop at a conviction or a settlement. With the spotlight fixed on the city, Jamal and Brandon launched a public initiative, the Sinclair Project, an independent watchdog group aimed at investigating racially motivated policing. They recruited lawyers, advocates, former officers, community leaders, black, white, Latino, and beyond. The mission was simple. If the system refused to police itself, the people would do it instead. The mayor, under pressure, appointed Jamal as the head of a new civil oversight committee, giving him unprecedented access to police data, complaints, and arrest patterns. Reforms began to roll in. Mandatory de-escalation training, new accountability systems, body cam requirements, and most notably, the quiet resignation of several officers who had once stood with Foster. Meanwhile, Foster was formally charged with civil rights violations, falsification of reports, and misconduct in public office. He pled not guilty, but the trial was swift. Witnesses from his past surfaced, former detainees, colleagues who had once feared speaking out, and a retired lieutenant who admitted that Foster's behavior had been overlooked because he got results. The final verdict came on a rainy Friday morning. Guilty. The judge, no relation to Jamal, delivered the sentence without flair. Foster would serve time, not life, but enough to make him feel the weight of the lives he had damaged. As the courtroom emptied, Jamal sat alone for a moment. Rain tapped softly against the windows, a steady rhythm to the end of a chapter. Brandon returned from the hallway, holding a dozen missed calls from reporters. "You okay?" he asked. Jamal looked at him. "Not really," he said quietly. "But I will be. When this stops happening to people who don't wear robes, when kids stop growing up afraid of the people sworn to protect them, when justice isn't a privilege, then I'll be okay." Brandon nodded. "We're not done, are we?" Jamal shook his head. "Not even close." And outside, in the streets of a city that had been shaken awake, the wind picked up. Banners, calling for change, fluttered against light poles. The faces in the crowds were diverse, determined, and somewhere among them, a teenage boy held a hand-painted sign that simply read, "Judge Sinclair stood. So now we do too." The courtroom was packed by 9 a.m., though the official session wasn't scheduled until 10. The line outside the courthouse wrapped around the building, media trucks parked along the curb like a fortress of flashing eyes. Cameramen, journalists, law students, activists, and curious onlookers all gathered for what had now become the most high-profile case in Missouri in over a decade, State versus Deputy Leonard Foster. Inside, the tension hung like a thick fog, palpable, dense, electric. The kind of energy that makes people sit a little straighter, speak a little softer. It was more than just a trial. It was a reckoning, a convergence of past and present, of power and consequence. And as the crowd murmured quietly beneath the vaulted ceiling, Jamal Sinclair sat at the front row of the gallery, flanked by Brandon Hale and several civil rights attorneys, dressed in dark suits and fire-forged composure. This wasn't about vengeance. Jamal had made that clear in every interview leading up to this day. But beneath his calm gaze was a current of deep, unrelenting resolve. His presence alone carried weight, not as a victim, but as a symbol. He was the living contradiction of every false assumption Deputy Foster had made that day, and now it was time for the system Foster once abused to return the favor, lawfully, publicly, and unapologetically. When Foster entered the courtroom, all whispers ceased. He wore a navy blue suit that seemed too big for him now. His frame, once rigid with arrogance, had slouched in the weeks of silence, scrutiny, and unraveling. The once feared deputy now looked smaller, hollowed by the collapse of the armor he had worn for years, authority. He walked past the gallery, his eyes briefly flicking toward Jamal. He looked for something, remorse, perhaps understanding, but found only steel. There was no hatred in Jamal's expression, just the kind of quiet that judges learn to wield like a scalpel. The trial resumed. At the prosecutor's table, Assistant U.S. Attorney Denise Carrington, sharp as a blade and relentless in her precision, stood to deliver the final closing argument. Her voice, steady and piercing, cut through the room. "This case," she began, her tone calm but thunderous in impact, is not just about a wrongful arrest. It is not merely about a deputy who misjudged a man. It is about a pattern, a culture, a disease that festers when authority becomes arrogance and bias becomes policy. On the morning of March 6th, Deputy Leonard Foster did not see a man. He saw a target. He did not ask for a name. He did not confirm identity. He assumed, judged, humiliated, and arrested a federal judge who had committed no crime but existed in black skin in the wrong zip code. The jury watched her with frozen focus. Even the judge, Honorable Miriam Lattimore, a respected jurist, with decades on the bench, listened intently, her fingers templed beneath her chin. Carrington continued, "Imagine if this had happened to someone without power, someone without resources, someone without a friend like Mr. Hale. Would they be sitting here today? Or would they have disappeared into a holding cell, into a statistic, into a silence we've all grown too used to?" She turned and gestured subtly to Jamal, whose presence spoke volumes even in stillness. Judge Sinclair had the rare fortune to walk back out of that precinct and tell his story, but how many others haven't? "This is your moment," she said, her voice swelling with clarity. "Your moment to draw the line, to say enough, to remind every officer who wears a badge that it does not come with a license to degrade, but a duty to protect." She ended with quiet finality. "We don't convict badges, we convict the men who tarnish them." And then she sat. The defense attorney rose, a wiry man with graying hair named Samuel Klein, whose job had been thankless from the start. He attempted to appeal to logic, suggesting that Foster had acted on instinct in a dangerous neighborhood, that he didn't know who Jamal was, that the situation escalated too quickly. But the words rang hollow. No one was buying it, because instincts aren't supposed to ignore identity, and mistakes don't get multiple victims over multiple years. The jury recessed to deliberate. The gallery buzzed, breath held beneath conversations too soft to echo. Jamal stood and walked to the hallway, needing air, not from nerves, but from clarity. He leaned against the marble column and looked out the window. Rain tapped gently against the glass. The city moved outside, unaware that its soul sat on trial inside. Brandon joined him. "You good?" he asked. Jamal nodded. "Yeah, it's just strange. All this noise, but inside I feel quiet, like everything I've been waiting to say has already been said." Brandon leaned beside him. "That's because the truth speaks louder than anger." Jamal gave a small, knowing smile. "You're getting poetic on me." "I've been spending too much time with the judge." They stood in silence for a moment. Then came the call. "Jury has returned." The courtroom filled once more. Reporters readied their pens, cameras poised. Foster sat beside his counsel, visibly sweating. Jamal returned to his seat. The bailiff nodded to the clerk. The verdict form was passed to the judge. Judge Lattimore unfolded it. She glanced at it, then at the jury. "Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," the forewoman said, her voice steady but weighted. "Please stand." Everyone rose. The city held its breath. In the matter of State of Missouri versus Deputy Leonard Foster, on the count of unlawful arrest, we find the defendant guilty. A ripple spread across the gallery. On the count of violating civil rights under color of law, guilty. Jamal remained still. Eyes locked forward. On the count of official misconduct, guilty. A hush fell again, heavier this time. The judge nodded. "So recorded." The silence after the gavel fell was louder than applause. Foster sat stunned, as if the words had sliced him in places he didn't know existed. He turned to his attorney, then to the gallery, and finally to Jamal, his eyes watery, mouth trembling. I didn't mean for it to," he whispered, but the words trailed off. Jamal stood, calmly walked toward him. For a moment the courtroom went breathless. He stopped 2 feet from the man who once crushed his dignity against a wall. "I know you didn't," Jamal said, his voice low but firm. "That's the problem." Then he turned and walked away. Outside, the media swarmed. Microphones were thrust toward Jamal, questions flying like arrows. "Judge Sinclair, do you feel vindicated? What does this verdict mean for the city? Is this justice?" Jamal paused on the steps. He raised his hand and spoke not as a plaintiff, not as a judge, but as a man trying to turn pain into purpose. "This verdict is not the end," he said. "It's the beginning of a city confronting what it allowed for far too long. This isn't about one deputy. It's about a culture that must change. Today, a jury said that no one, not even someone with a badge, is above accountability. But tomorrow, we must ask, what are we doing for those without power, without protection, without the platform I have? Justice isn't a moment. It's a movement, and I plan to keep moving. Behind him, Brandon nodded with pride. The crowd listened. The city listened. Somewhere, a boy in East Kansas City, where Jamal once walked those same cracked sidewalks, watched from home and saw what resistance looked like in a suit and a calm voice. Not rage, not violence, just truth, unshaken. And so the gavel had fallen. But the echo, Jamal knew, was just getting started. The dust didn't settle, it scattered. Across the city, across newsrooms, across precincts where silence had long been policy. The verdict in State versus Foster sent a shockwave through Kansas City's worn political crust, rattling chairs that hadn't shifted in decades. The conviction of a white police officer for the unlawful arrest and humiliation of a black federal judge wasn't just a judicial event, it was a civic earthquake. Old alliances began to fracture. Long-ignored records were unsealed. Whispered stories once passed in barbershops and backrooms now screamed from front pages. Some called it justice, others called it dangerous precedent. But everyone, on both sides of the line, knew that something irreversible had happened. For Jamal Sinclair, the days following the verdict were not quiet. If anything, they grew louder. Not with noise, but with expectation. The world now saw him not only as the man who survived and exposed injustice, but the man who might fix it. Every civil rights group in the region wanted to partner. Every TV outlet requested interviews. Mayors from surrounding cities called for policy input. School children wrote letters. Young black boys addressed envelopes to Judge Jamal, telling him how proud they were, how seen they felt for the first time. But Jamal wasn't interested in fame. He'd tasted enough of the spotlight to know it burns as much as it brightens. What he wanted, what he needed, was change. With Brandon Hale at his side, Jamal launched the Sinclair Initiative, a full-scale coalition effort involving lawyers, educators, former law enforcement, community elders, and grassroots activists. Its mission was threefold: reform, reconciliation, and rebuilding. They began hosting public listening sessions, town halls packed with anger, pain, stories, and tears. People who had never spoken out before stood up. Single mothers describing their sons tackled for matching vague descriptions. War veterans arrested for walking too slowly past storefronts. A high school teacher with a broken wrist and a bruised spirit. And in each session, Jamal sat quietly, listening, just as he had in courtrooms for years. But this time he wasn't wearing a robe. He was wearing sleeves rolled up and scars on display. Meanwhile, Deputy Leonard Foster, now inmate Foster, sat in a different kind of spotlight. Stripped of his badge, sentenced to serve time in a minimum security facility, his life was now a far cry from the one he once ruled with intimidation and hollow confidence. The guards didn't nod to him anymore. The inmates didn't fear him. And the name Foster no longer commanded authority, it drew ridicule. The weight of public disgrace crushed him more than the sentence itself. And in the echo of his new reality, the faces of those he once cuffed without cause began to haunt him, not just Jamal's, but the countless others whose names he never bothered to learn. Inside the prison chapel, Foster began writing letters, not to escape judgment, but perhaps to find a sliver of redemption. He wrote one to Jamal. It arrived 3 weeks after the verdict, typed, signed, folded, with the care of a man who knew every word might be the last he was ever taken seriously for. I didn't understand what I was doing until I lost what I thought made me who I was. I can't undo what I did. I can't ask you to forgive me. But I needed to say it. I was wrong. About you. About the badge. About myself. Jamal read it once. Then again. He didn't respond. Not right away. Because some things he believed had to sit in silence for a while before you knew what they really meant. Public pressure mounted on the police chief, who until now had managed to survive controversies with carefully curated statements and backroom handshakes. But this scandal had ignited something different, a fire not of politics, but of purpose. The chief was called to testify before the State Commission on Law Enforcement Ethics. And though he tried to dance around the issue, it became clear he'd either known about Foster's record and ignored it, or failed to know at all. Either way, His resignation followed within a month. And yet, even with a deputy behind bars and a chief out of office, Jamal felt no triumph. Not because the system had failed, but because it had worked exactly as designed, until it failed the wrong man. He began to travel across the country, accepting invitations not as a political figure but as a teacher, speaking to new recruits at police academies, testifying at legislative hearings, addressing universities. But his speeches weren't grandstanding. They were measured, intense, and deeply personal. The danger isn't just bad cops, guys, he'd say. It's good cops trained by bad culture. It's not the monster in the alley, it's the mirror you avoid. Meanwhile, Brandon took the lead on litigating several class action lawsuits against the department, representing dozens of citizens who came forward in the wake of the trial. The lawsuits exposed systemic patterns, manipulated evidence logs, unfiled complaints, and body cam footage mysteriously corrupted. The department was forced to pay millions in settlements, but the greater cost was intangible, the trust of a city finally demanding better. With that momentum, the Sinclair Act was introduced in the Missouri State Legislature, a sweeping reform bill co-authored by Jamal, Brandon, and a coalition of bipartisan lawmakers. It proposed independent civilian review boards with subpoena power, mandatory racial bias training and psychological screening, a transparent statewide misconduct registry for officers' public access to body cam footage within 14 days of any arrest. At first, the bill faced resistance. Lobbyists pushed back. Police unions threatened strikes, but the public, galvanized by Jamal's calm insistence, would not let it die. Petitions flooded in, marches resumed, and after months of debate, closed-door negotiations, and one dramatic midnight session, the Sinclair Act passed. On the day of the signing, Jamal stood behind the governor, not for the photo op, but for the moment. As the pen touched paper, he felt nothing like closure. What he felt was continuity. The echo of 1,000 unnamed voices carried through him, and he nodded to the crowd, not in celebration, but in solemn recognition. This wasn't his victory, it was theirs. Months passed. The city changed, slowly, not always neatly, but it changed. Patrol officers were retrained. Transparency became policy, not promise. A new police commissioner was appointed, a black woman from the East Side who once sued the department herself for wrongful suspension. Now she ran it. Under her leadership, the culture began to shift, not perfectly, but with direction. In the heart of the city, an old, crumbling courthouse annex was converted into a justice resource center, funded by a blend of state grants and grassroots donations. Its name, the Sinclair Center for Equity and Reform. At its grand opening, Jamal stood before the crowd, this time not as a judge or victim, but as a builder of something new. He gave no long speech, only a sentence. This is what justice looks like after the trial ends. Children toured the halls. Muralists painted the walls with faces of changemakers. And in the library upstairs, under a skylight dripping morning sun, a small bronze plaque read, "Dedicated to those whose voices were silenced. May their silence never be mistaken for surrender." That evening, Jamal walked alone through the East Side, the neighborhood where he once grew up, dodging suspicion, where he'd been stopped more times than he could count. But now the sidewalks felt different. Not safer, but more aware. A young man on a bike rode past, stopped, turned. "Judge Sinclair?" he asked. Jamal turned. "Yes?" The boy smiled. "You came to our school last month. I didn't talk, but I listened. I just wanted to say thanks." Jamal nodded, warmth in his chest. "Thank you for listening." The boy pointed at a building across the street. "That's my uncle's barbershop. He says he knew you when you were a kid. Said you were quiet, always reading." Jamal chuckled. "That sounds about right." The boy hesitated, then asked, "You think it'll get better? Like, really better?" Jamal looked at him for a long moment. The question wasn't naive. It was profound. It was the same question he'd asked himself every day since he walked out of that interrogation room in handcuffs. He stepped closer. "I think it gets better," Jamal said, "when people like you don't stop asking that question, and people like me don't stop answering it." The boy nodded and rode away, and as Jamal watched the fading tail light disappear into the city's twilight, he felt a rare kind of peace. Not the kind that comes from justice served, but from justice still being fought for, and that, he realized, was the true verdict. Not what the jury decided, not what the judge ruled, but what a city chose to become after it had been shown who it truly was. The story of Jamal Sinclair reflects a profound truth about today's world, that injustice doesn't always wear a hood. It often wears a badge, a suit, or silence. Racial profiling, abuse of power, and systemic bias remain harsh realities in many communities across the globe. Jamal's experience, being humiliated not because of what he did, but because of who he was and where he was, mirrors the lived experiences of countless individuals who are judged before they're heard. But his response also offers a powerful lesson. Dignity in the face of oppression is not weakness, it's strength. Jamal didn't seek revenge, he sought accountability, transparency, and reform. And he used his platform not just to speak, but to amplify others who couldn't. In today's life, the lesson is this. When we witness injustice, whether in our streets, workplaces, schools, or even online, we must not stay silent. We must use our voice, our vote, and our values to challenge systems that thrive on silence. Change begins not just with outrage, but with action. Like Jamal, we must be willing to transform pain into purpose and stand for something greater than ourselves. A world where justice is not a privilege, but a shared right. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like, and comment 1 if you found the story meaningful. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. See you in the next one.